Good morning, everybody. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Philipp Kruse. Together with my 10 colleagues from 9 different countries, I would like to welcome you here at our press conference. We are here because of this World Health Assembly's negotiations about the 2 pandemic treaties going on, and we would like to inform you. It is an honor for me to jointly host and moderate this press conference together with my colleague, Dr. Renate Holzeisen. Dr. Renate Holzeisen is an attorney at law and an economist from Italy with her own legal practice in southern Tyrol. And Dr. Renate Holzeisen is active since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis in submitting the mandates to a judicial reconsideration, and also she has submitted major cases to the European Court of Justice in order to have the authorizations of the mRNA-based substances being declared null and void. We will, yes?
And Philipp Kruse is, as you may know, a Swiss attorney at law with his own law firm in Zurich, specialized in tax and business law. Since 2020, he led many court procedures against unconstitutional COVID-19 mandates, including a criminal complaint against Swissmedic for unlawfully authorization of the harmful mRNA substances.
Thank you, Renate. So the purpose of this press conference is to provide you with a first critical analysis from the legal and constitutional perspective of what has been concluded or not concluded by the 77th World Health Assembly. This whole topic is widely underreported and not sufficiently understood. Therefore, we as the lawyers, we feel it as our obligation to inform the world and the people and also the representatives from the different countries with respect to the far-reaching effects that these 2 new legal instruments will have. It is Saturday, 1st of June, and now 20 minutes past 10 here in Geneva, and as we speak, the 77th World Health Assembly is still going on, and we still not have a final conclusion about the amendments to the international health regulations. And the latest information I received is that both legal instruments will be postponed for a later vote later this year. In such a situation, we as lawyers must always make reservations that a proper legal analysis needs time and can only be done if the final wording is on the table. Therefore, our statements can only be of preliminary nature. But together with other lawyers, researchers, and observers, we will provide a more conclusive and a more mature assessments in the weeks and months to come. Now, in our press conference, we will also present some of the most relevant initiatives that have been submitted by citizens and by members of parliament to foster a critical awareness about recent WHO developments. Now, I start after this introduction with my first part, and then afterwards, one lawyer after the other will present one aspect or more aspect of these 2 pandemic treaties and the critical aspects. Now, as I said, there is no formal adoption of neither of the treaties. And regarding the new pandemic treaty, we already knew at the beginning of this week that it was going to postpone. Regarding the amendments to the international health regulations, there were intense negotiations going on late into this night under the tremendous pressure of the representatives of the United States to come to a conclusion. What can we say about what is on the table? Where do we have the highest concern, and why do we have to raise our voice against these two legal instruments? In particular, the amendments to the IHR as we have them on the table as drafts right now. Number one, you have all heard that there is a binding rule in the international health regulations themselves, Article 55, paragraph 2, that clearly states that the final wording of any amendment to the international health regulations must be submitted to the member states at least 4 months in advance. The World Health Organization claims to have done so by submitting to the world and publishing in November 2022 a compilation of 300 different proposals, almost not consolidated, in fact, with many different options for many different provisions in the same time. And what we have seen from the latest drafts, they brought new aspects into the game that nobody knew before, like what we have seen in Annex 1. And it is a matter of principle that all those parties that are involved and affected by the new rules are given their voice and their consent before the delegates can give their vote in favor of an agreement. Therefore, we certainly must never put aside this 4 months rule. Then we have to clearly state that this instrument, this legal instrument of a regulation, was never meant to comprise so far-reaching new rules that affect member states but also citizens. And here I give you just a brief enumeration of the most relevant far-reaching rules that we see on the table in the international health regulations in combination with the pandemic treaty. Number one, Annex 1 to the international health regulations under the title of core capacity provides far-reaching duties, imposes far-reaching duties onto the member states and their regions and their municipalities also to establish a system of permanent surveillance with the principle or the method that is then governed by the treaty of genomic sequencing. Here, this is one aspect where we see far-reaching duties coming up to the states and to their local regions and communities. Number two, we have an arbitrarian widening of a pretext for a fake that other of my colleagues will go into more detail, but we will see that it is arbitrarian how the WHO wants to allow itself to base a public health emergency of international concern on no standardized procedures based on a constant surveillance. We will have Reggie Littlejohn, my colleague Beate Bahner, and Professor Tritto speak about this principle of constant surveillance, and Professor Tritto about the unlawful method of genomic sequencing. Number three, this concept of infodemics. Although the term was removed from the treaty, but still, the provisions we see in the amendments and the treaty combined together, we see that WHO will be strengthened, and member states as well, in their authority to dominate and control the publicly available information. Just go into Annex 1 of the IHR, go into the treaty, go to the homepage of the World Health Organization, also research about Infodemics Manager, which is a program that exists already for many years, and so on. What does it mean? By strengthening WHO's capacity to control the information, we are going to deprive people of the factual basis for the decision-making process, and that is an element of actually dragging people into a behavior, in particular a treatment that they do not want, and ultimately a violation of mandatory international and national laws regarding the informed consent, which will be further elaborated by my colleague Sue Gray from New Zealand and by my colleague Dr. Beate Pfeil from Germany. Further, WHO's next point, the authority to define substances, specific substances as a precondition for traveling, and to use even and recommend even substances that have never been tested before, but authorized only under the regime of emergency use authorization. I refer to the treaty Article 14 and to the IHR rules Article 36 and Annex 6. That will result in the member states not being able to protect their own population against uncalculable health risks from experimental substances. And again, it will result in the breach of the most fundamental rules to protect informed consent. Further, we must state that with all this, and I have just given you some examples, but there are further accruals and increasing powers of the WHO, in particular also financial powers. We do not see anything that could be called an checks and balances or quality control and correction mechanism. With such a far-reaching range of powers, it is a matter of legal principality that a mechanism of quality control and correction be established. Otherwise, this is a violation of one of the most fundamental principles of democratic constitution. Now, all of this taken together, we see these far-reaching provisions, and as I said, so far-reaching new rules obliging member states and their citizens ultimately, and affecting their citizens, were never meant to be put into this instrument of regulations as it is defined in the World Health Organization's constitution in Article 21. They are meant only to rule about technical standards. Now, we have a fundamental objection against any attempt to rush into these uncharted waters and to grant the WHO even more powers and more financial capacities without ever having done a proper professional and critical assessment of all aspects of the WHO's pandemic management and of its recommendations and communications of the past. We believe that this should be the absolute first step before enlarging the powers of the WHO and giving the WHO more financial means. Since 2020, the World Health Assembly never acknowledged the urgent need for effective quality control of WHO's and member states' own pandemic management. If we do not undergo this process that might be harmful for WHO and the member states, we clearly embark on a road where further and similar damages are pre-programmed. And as we all know, the sole purpose of WHO, according to its own constitution, is to protect people from any harm and to foster health of the people of the world. What we see now is a program to harm people's health and people's right. That was just an overview of the most important aspects. Now, I gladly hand over the word and the floor to my dear colleague, Reggie Littlejohn from the United States. Thank you.
Welcome. My name is Reggie Littlejohn. I am the founder and president of Anti-Globalist International, also Women's Rights Without Frontiers, and I'm the co-founder and co-chair of the Sovereignty Coalition. And I want to thank Dr. Philipp Kruse for inviting me to speak and for really the heroic efforts he has put in bringing this all together. So we come to you as lawyers from 9 different countries to sound the alarm about the pandemic treaty, and we want to show you chapter and verse exactly why, from a legal perspective, we are very concerned about these 2 treaties. One is the One Health approach. Could I have the my PowerPoint, please? This can be found in Article 5 of the May 27th, 2024 draft of the pandemic treaty. And
Thank you.
all right. Okay. So what is One Health? In the introduction, the use of terms, it defines One Health as a means of an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance, that's the important word, balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. So what does that mean? It means that people are not the main concern. Our interests have to be balanced against those of animals and plants and the ecosystem. So number one, this is what the Lancet calls the call to ecological equity, and they say all life is equal and of equal concern. So that means that your life, my life, the lives of our children, our parents, our loved ones are equal and of equal concern to the life of a cockroach or a mosquito. Furthermore, what One Health does is bring basically every aspect of life on Earth under the purview of the World Health Assembly, or the World Health Organization. So they are basically saying that everything needs to be surveilled and that they can issue what they would call recommendations, which many countries will interpret as being basically orders, on the front of human health, animal health, plant health, and the ecology, which means that they can use climate change as to assert their authority in the climate change area, say, look, the climate is hurting health, et cetera. I mean, they can even get into aspects of war between nations, that it's bad for health, try to insert themselves in that way. So, and how are they going to implement this? They don't tell us. They say that it's going to be further defined in an instrument that is going to be created in the future. Now, Article 4 of the Pandemic Treaty talks about pandemic prevention and public health surveillance and calls for multi-sectoral surveillance and risk assessment, saying the parties recognize the environmental, climatic, social, anthropogenic, and economic factors that lead to human health. There again, all of these factors lead to human health under the One Health approach, and that means they get to surveil all of these areas of human existence, basically every aspect of human existence under the One Health. How are they going to do this? They're going to do this through digital IDs, in part. That's how they're going to surveil. Keep going. Here, and so the pretext of these digital IDs is the idea that in order to protect our health, they have to surveil us in terms of whether we're vaccinated, whether we're sick, et cetera. But I think that the real purpose of the digital ID can be found on the World Economic Forum website, where they have this chart. And you will see in this chart that basically you will need to have a digital ID in order to do everything on this chart. To access healthcare, insurance, and treatment, open bank accounts, and carry on online transactions, to travel, to access humanitarian services, to shop and conduct business transactions, to participate in social media, to own a communication device like a cell phone or a computer, to pay your taxes, collect government benefits, and to vote. So if you don't have a digital ID, you're going to be shut out of basically every aspect of civilized life on Earth. And not only that, but through their surveillance, they will be able to tell whether or not you are in compliance. So the surveillance number one is whether or not you're vaccinated, but they're going to be surveilling if you need a digital ID to access all of these things, then there's going to be a digital record of you in all of these aspects of your life. And what this does is it provides the platform for the China social credit system, which is how I got involved with all of this. My original organization deals with women's rights in China. And when I saw this digital ID, I said, oh my gosh, this is the China social credit system going worldwide. And in China, they amalgamate all of these aspects of your life, and they give you a score, and if you have a high score, you can have freedom, and if you have a low score, they will cut you off from your bank accounts, your credit cards, and if you keep it up, they will just disappear you. And if you think this can't happen, it did happen already to the Canadian truckers when they were severed from their bank accounts and their credit cards for having a protest on vaccine mandates. Now, the pandemic agreement in Chapter 3 establishes the Conference of the Parties. And the only thing I have time to say about the Conference of the Parties is it's a completely separate entity. But what it does is it has the ability to amend the pandemic treaty. And there's no ratification process for that. So that the various governments could hammer out something finally everybody can agree with, and then the Conference of the Parties can just change it. And there's no ratification process that goes back to the nations. Regarding the international health regulations, there is a provision there about censorship. This is in Annex 1, core capacities. And each state party shall develop core capacities for risk communication, including addressing misinformation and disinformation. They don't define what those are, but I would commend to you that this is going to be anything that is counter narrative to what the WHO is putting out. So this is a way of shutting down scientific debate. That's all the time I have to talk to you about this, but I would say that we are facing an existential threat to our national sovereignty and our personal medical freedom, and we are at a moment in human history where we really need to draw a line in the sand and say, we'll go so far and no further. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie Littlejohn.
I asked our colleague, Dr. Beate Pfeil, a legal expert, to continue.
So, thank you, Renate. Hello, I'm a lawyer and independent researcher and a former Council of Europe expert, and my focus is on human rights, national minorities, and most recently also the WHO. I'm a member of different legal initiatives dealing with this subject. So, do I need this, or is it? Yeah, I think it's a. Is it? Can you hear me also without it? Okay. Okay. So I would like to begin with a statement which I will try to back up with a few, but hopefully illustrative examples. The two WHO treaties represent a threat to the dignity, freedom, and even to the health of the people around the world. The majority of the delegates in the World Health Assembly would certainly reject such a thesis. Why? There is, of course, no doubt that both current draft versions contain commitments to human dignity and human rights. There is no doubt that the WHO has committed itself in its constitution to achieving the highest attainable standard of health for all peoples. There is no doubt that the WHO Director General, when deciding to declare or not to declare a public health emergency of international concern, or more recently a pandemic emergency, is bound by certain criteria, more or less clearly defined, in particular by the list of infectious diseases contained in Annex 2 of the IHR. According to Article 12, he has also taken into account scientific principles and the available scientific evidence, and he has to assess the risk to human health and the risk of international spread of disease. Finally, even if the Director General has declared a fake and is about to issue recommendations, he is bound by objective criteria. First and foremost, he must again observe scientific principles and scientific evidence. On this basis, he has to check even the proportionality of the measures he recommends on the basis of Article 12. For example, if he recommends vaccinations or vaccination obligations, he of course has to check whether this vaccination is able to contain the spread of disease, or if this might not cause more harm than good. Many delegates would thus say everything is fine, and even add that there is a number of committees of experts who assist the Director General in his decisions. But we must then unfortunately reply that nothing is fine. All these commitments and criteria are not worth the paper they are printed on if there is no independent body to monitor the WHO and in particular the Director General. Especially in view of the extensive powers of the Director General, an independent supervisory body, a system of checks and balances would be indispensable and the only way to prevent unjustified fake decisions and violations of fundamental human rights. The WHO system does not provide, of course, for an independent supervisory body. The members of the emergency committee, for example, are appointed and dismissed by the Director General himself, and their recommendations are even not binding. In addition, there are other fundamental flaws in the WHO system which can have a fatal impact on its action and decision-making. First, as we all know, the WHO is now almost 85% dependent on voluntary donations, and the private donors include pharmaceutical foundations and organizations. We all know the Gates Foundation, round the corner here, and Gavi. Second, scientific evidence presupposes free scientific discourse. Instead, the WHO has set itself the goal of combating misinformation and disinformation. So what about scientific evidence if an important part of the scientific community is being excluded from this scientific discourse? It is precisely here, and of course we have censorship, as my colleague has also membered, in the wake of these regulations. It is precisely here in the area that sensitively affects freedom of opinion, information and science, and also the freedom of the media, that the WHO has established around 40 partnerships with big tech companies from the digital sector, whose contracts are just as undisclosed as the financing of the WHO infodemic activities. The Global Health Responsibility Agency, governed by Dr. Sylvia Behrendt from Austria, has also long since drawn attention to another lack of transparency. For example, although WHO staff and experts must regularly submit conflict of interest declarations, these are generally not published with reference to confidentiality and data protection, but are only managed internally by the WHO Secretariat. There is also no standardized procedure for cases of rule violations by WHO management personnel in the context of corruption prevention. Another point, in this context, the fact that both treaties now focus on so-called health products, including, of course, vaccines, and their equitable distribution leaves a stale aftertaste. All the more so as, according to the emergency use listing procedure of August 2022, the relevant expert reports are merely recommendations, and the WHO has, I cite, full control over any subsequent decisions and actions of these committees, including whether or not to publish the findings and recommendations in a WHO public report. However, this is precisely where full transparency would be called for, as it is ultimately the health and physical integrity of the world's population that the WHO actually has declared to protect. So, to conclude, there are no efficient safeguards against abuses of power influenced by private profit and other interests by the WHO. And, for example, this opens the door to the arbitrary declaration of fakes and arbitrary recommendations of measures such as vaccinations, testing obligations, isolation and quarantine, travel and trade restrictions, or even lockdowns, which ultimately have not been sufficiently tested for the effectiveness or harmfulness. So the WHO has long been operating outside a framework that is still acceptable for democratic constitutional states under the rule of law. At stake are elementary human rights that have long been recognized under international law, not least the right to physical integrity and health. The WHO plans must therefore be rejected. Thank you.
Now, I gladly give over the floor to my dear colleague from Israel, Schwartz.
Good afternoon. Thank you. I will preface by saying that I will not refer to specific articles. It didn't make any sense to me since they're changing the documents all the time. So even if I will refer to them, what's true today may not be true tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, I am a lawyer. I have a graduate degree from the Hebrew University in international public law, and I focused on state responsibility and human rights. I did quite a bit of research on this subject and wrote some papers for the Israeli media and the Israeli interest parties. I don't want to specify them, so I'll leave it at that at this point. What I would like to focus on is the notion of sovereignty. The whole idea of sovereignty has been said here, but we need to focus on that because sovereignty is really what is being attacked. And sovereignty is comprised of two elements. I'm not attempting to define it. Any definition is basically subjective. It's contextual. So I'm not defining sovereignty. I'm analyzing what it is comprised of, what makes up sovereignty. And sovereignty is made up, I found, of two things. One is judicious evaluation of the data that you have in order to reach conclusions. The other thing is the implementation of that conclusion that you reach with your evaluation. Once you have that, if you have both contemporaneously, you are sovereign. Take any of them away or take the contemporaneity of it, make them not contemporaneous, and you lost your sovereignty. And here is what the WHO is doing. What they are, with very convoluted language, attacking the state's ability to either employ judicious evaluation or implement what they want to do. They being the states. I'll say it unequivocally. The WHO, and especially its globalist handlers, their aim is to get a control of the world through a centralized government. Remember, the World Health Organization is not a health provider organization. It's a bureaucratic organization. We must be mistaken about that. As expressed in the preamble of April 24, the WHO now aims at being, because it hasn't been up until now, aims at being it wants to be the international health work, including, the directing and coordinating authority of international health work, including on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. They want to define and decide. They want to be the authority. Mark Twain is believed to have said that a lie travels around the globe while the truth is still putting on its shoes. And the saying that half the truth is often a great lie was attributed to Benjamin Franklin. I beg to add another notion. Liars and demagogues consider manipulation of people's minds and of information to be good management. And this is what we're encountering. To understand the lies and manipulations that we're encountering, we had to dive deep underneath many layers, because nothing is stated directly. Things are stated implicitly, and you really have to analyze and go deep into what's being said there. Just to give you some examples, in the pandemic treaty, as we call it, there was an article, it used to be 15.2G, but then it changed eventually to some other article, it doesn't really matter at this point, where they referred to states being attached to the Nagoya Protocol of the 1992 Rio Convention. See, the thing is that this 1992 convention and its following protocol of Nagoya, 40 countries did not accept it. But if you do accept the articles and the IHR, and you do accept the treaty, implicitly you accept that instrument which the country did not want to accept to begin with. Except they're not saying that. They're introducing it in a very underhanded manner. A second example to be found is in the proposed amendments is the use of the term equity. Equity is not equality. Let there be no confusion. Equity has been defined as an administered political economy in which shares are adjusted so that citizens are made equal. This is the very description of Marxism and Maoism. A third example would be in the attempt to introduce a compliance committee into the states, plus a health authority. By that, the WHO aims at inserting itself literally forcefully into the sovereignty of the countries. I'm short of time, I have to finish here, but what I've just described to you are various instruments through which what the WHO is attempting to do is circumvent and nullify the sovereignty of states and peoples. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Alfred Schwartz. And now we will hear Dr. Renate Holzeisen from Italy. She will speak about the anticipation of the new pandemic regime of the WHO by the EU.
Yeah, thank you, Philipp. And for that, I have to remind you that although the so-called, I have to remind you that although the so-called COVID-19 vaccines never have been designed, tested, and authorized for the prevention of the virus transmission, it was the EU Commission which introduced the so-called COVID-19 certificate, and which the WHO decided last year to roll out worldwide. And although the so-called COVID-19 vaccines never have been confirmed in their efficacy in preventing the disease and in their safety, because the control groups were annulled in the clinical studies which the European Commission, based on European Union law, had foreseen in the original conditional authorization, they now are authorized for 5 years, renewable, and without any condition. By the way, the annulment of the control groups in the clinical studies is based on opinion of the WHO that it would have been ethically not justifiable to not offer the so-called COVID-19 vaccines to the members of the control group. Already in September 2021, the EU Commission installed the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, HERA, and this was the first step in the creation of what is called European Health Union. In November 2022, the Parliament and the Council of the European Union, without informing the European Union citizens, introduced already the 2 key principles, one health and health in all policies. And introduced also a common union-wide strategy and mechanism for the so-called prevention, preparedness, and response to serious cross-border threats. These so-called serious cross-border threats are also referred to climate issues. And so you can imagine the European Union has an impact in all the fields of politics of the European Union member states. It was also installed a prevention, preparedness, and response planning at the European Union level, and that means that the Commission, in cooperation with the Member States and in accordance with the WHO Emergency Preparedness and Response Framework, shall establish a Union health crisis and pandemic plan, which shall complement the national prevention. And that means that an enormous market for those actors in what the European Union and the WHO understands as prevention and preparedness, the vaccine and diagnostic producers. This enormous market was created as a perpetuum mobile with unlimited economic growth and with enormous costs, which we European Union citizens have to bear. The European Commission was also given the power to formally declare a public health emergency at Union level, and the European Union declared the leadership of the WHO and the will to support the binding modification of the international health regulation and a legally binding pandemic treaty. And the Council of the European Union at the end of November 2022, after introducing these 2 regulations, which are binding law in our European Union member states, concluded on vaccination as one of the most effective tools for preventing disease and improving health, and decided to combat the so-called vaccine hesitancy. And there is not a single word spent on the serious side effects of these experimental substances, which are the so-called COVID-19 vaccines. But there was the clear decision by our ministers, I call them none of health, to combat vaccine hesitancy, the risk of so-called mis- and disinformation, declaring the so-called infodemics as the greatest threat. And critics to the only allowed opinion, which is that of the WHO, is defined by the European Union organs as distrust in science. the Council decided joint actions in vaccination programs in order to raise the vaccination coverage rates in the European Union member states by fulfillment of the European Union Immunization Agenda 2030, published by the WHO, in cooperation with the education sector, the social partners, and actions targeting the media. And this development in this politics, which I call vaccines from the cradle to the grave, is very alarming because we faced already the total failure of our justice system, which is simply referring to the opinion of the WHO and to the fact that the European Commission authorized these experimental substances. And on top of this, I have to inform you that the European General Court, in 2 legal proceedings regarding the request of the annulment of the authorization of the mRNA-based COVID-19 so-called vaccines, declared in a dystopian obiter dictum that the member states would have full discretion to decide whether it is appropriate to impose to the doctors the use of the experimental mRNA COVID-19 vaccines, if necessary, by means of coercive measures. This is obviously the mindset of a totalitarian regime, but not, does not correspond to the European Union treaties, the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, and the European Convention of Human Rights. By the way, the reporting judge in these legal proceedings, now pending before the second instance, the European Court of Justice, was until 2019 for many years a high-ranking political employee of the European Commission. He was also the head of the cabinet of the president of the European Commission. And the European Commission was the opposing party in these 2 legal proceedings. And therefore, I have to conclude as a lawyer that we have in the European Union an unacceptable, huge problem with the so-called rolling doors, not only in the European Medicinal Agency, but also in the General Court of Justice, in the European Court of Justice, and that undermines completely the independence and impartiality of our judges, and who are deciding on our health and lives. And as a lawyer, I have to question European Union, quo vadis?
Thank you, Dr. Renate Holzeisen. I would like now to hand over the microphone to Professor Giuseppe Tritto, and I will briefly explain to you why we have the scientists also on our panel. We see many technical terms in these 2 legal instruments that are not legal terms and need interpretation and understanding. And in the context of providing the basis or the justification for a new public health emergency of international concern, we are concerned to see that WHO wants to have a much wider system of surveillance. Where do we see that? We see it, number 1, in Article 4 of the draft of the treaty, pandemic prevention and health, public health surveillance, collaborative surveillance, water, sanitation, hygiene. And we see it in the IHR in the Annex 1, clearly where it says surveillance on the level of the intermediate public health response and on the national public health response. And we see that these data that are being collected and found from there will be transferred onto a platform with the name Public Pathogen Access Benefit Sharing, which is, by the official side from WHO, referred to as an important source of information and exchange for information. What does this mean? Is this really a benefit for us? Does this platform of pathogen access, benefit sharing, really providing some evidence for either a real threat or what is it true. All of that is done with the method of genomic sequencing, which is explained in a strategy paper of WHO for the year 2022. And now please, Professor Giuseppe Tritto, would you please explain us the background about all of these technical details around this genomic sequencing and constant surveillance of sanitary water and other sources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. But Philipp Kruse explained all things, so I can conclude it all. No, we started from one practical thing, where this accelerator that is proposed by the direction of WHO, that take in charge from 2022, from 2030, 10 years of work on global genomic surveillance strategy for pathogens with pandemic and epidemic potential. So we have assisted in these years that the definition of a pandemic or epidemic is really not a clear definition. Just to this moment, no country is available to define pandemic, epidemic, and emergency pandemic or epidemic. So which trade can be immediately taken charge that can be a potential on that. Imagine that you are in the ICS in the space, you find a bacterium that is changed, is a new bacterium, it doesn't respond to the antibacterial antibiotic that we have on the Earth, and if the cosmonaut arrived on the Earth and diffuse that, we have a new epidemic that coming from space. Very simple, stupid things. But in this story of the global surveillance, genomic surveillance, this starts from the moment in which the CDC in the United States decided to create the global health security agenda. And after, during the climate change conference in Paris in 2020, in full pandemic, people taking charge of the climate change problem, and the president of the European Council, Mr. Michel, proposed to create a pandemic treaty on that. Imagine, we are closed in our house, and these people working for us. It's fantastic. We must give a Nobel Prize for humanity for these people. What is the implication of this global surveillance? One thing that is proposed by Bill Gates, that you create an intervention force to see what's happening to the country. That is a fire drill, they called in that. And when you look on the people who are that in this agency, this project, there is not only people representing the country, but also people who represent private panel, private cartel, as a Bill Gates Foundation, as a Clinton Foundation, etc. And this is totally in the infraction of the procedure of WHO that all people must remember is a simple agency of the 14 agencies of the United Nations. So it is submitted to all the rules of the United Nations. And the last premiership of WHO escaped completely to this rule, not only on the definition of pandemic, on the approval of the pandemic that must be approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations and not by the Secretary, General Secretary of United Nations, who create after the partnership with the World Economic Forum for the agenda of sustainable development. What is the problem of this global surveillance? There are two aspects from the medical point of view. First aspect, we must collect database. Database for all the country on the potential pathogen, whatsoever, etc. But this means sequencing also the agent. Isolate the agent, put the agent into a biobank, and then you have the sequencing with all the variety that you can find, the different variety of this type of things. But if you want to do that, you have the need also to take biological sample from the patient. So this is the creation of a biobank. This means that you can begin to investigate genomically population, not only pathogen. So the idea is to create a universal database bank for the pathogen, potential pathogen, and a biobank also for pathogen, a human being. To do that, we have the need of a complete agreement of the country in the world, in the United Nations, because, for two reasons. First, because it's the Declaration of Human Rights Protection, first, the first chapter. Second, it was the declaration of the General Assembly on the protection and integrity of the human genome. And when we are in virus, RNA, or DNA, they interfere with human genome. And third is the Treaty on Biodiversity, on the protection of biodiversity, on which also the human beings are part of this biodiversity. We are changing. We have an immunity system that is modulated during the time, has had a co-evolution. We are symbiotic people with a lot, trillions of bacteria and virus in our body that change progressively. So we have the need to study our microbiome in front of the biome of the earth. And now that we introduce synthetic biology with this transfecting agent that are called vaccine, but you remember that DARPA, when he created this platform on transfecting agent for human application, they defined gene encoding antigens. And after the FDA said, no, you cannot be approved in this way, so they transformed in gene encoding vaccine, but not the gene therapy because it was not possible to approve that. So we have drugs who work directly on the human genome. So we enter in the manipulation of human genome. How you can trace that? Because this is the problem. We have a pandemic of also a synthetic virus. You know, people discuss on synthetic biology. If you have a synthetic virus, as the virus was created in Wuhan, in other places, there are a lot of synthetic viruses potentially pathogen for humans. How you can differentiate with the test that you have today, a synthetic virus in the wild and a wild virus? And this is a big problem. You don't tell that PCR test can do that. Also the inventor of PCR test told we cannot do a diagnosis with the PCR test. We only show that there are fragments or RNA or DNA or modified RNA or DNA in nature, in the environment, that the human being. And you have the need to establish a cutoff to be sure that this test can be validated. That was not done during the pandemic. So we are not prepared today to do a genomic study at a large spectrum. We have the need to create center that can do that, but define the appropriate test that can be done. Because in agriculture we found it viroid, obelisk, there are the fruit of genetic manipulation of the transgenic plants. And now we find it that in the oral microbiome, 50% of patients selected with the obelisk and viroid in the human microbiome, and 5% on the stool of the human being. So we are assisted today with the global contamination, what we call the bioinfestation, from the industry who worked on plant virology, modification, etc., and on the food chain. This is the reason that people have fear today, who have the need to control all things, because they know that in 20 years they have contaminated the planet, that is a living planet. And we are the only people who have only this planet as our solution for the moment, not Mars. I think that I can close on that as a message, if you want.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor Tritto. Just to be very clear about that, one additional question we would like to know as lawyers, what is the quality of evidence of a pathogen that has been defined and identified exclusively on the basis of the method of pathogen genomic sequencing? What is the quality of the evidence if we want to take this pathogen as the basis for the next phase? Very brief.
Yes, we were presented a complaint to the International Court of The Hague against people who created this SARS-CoV-2 as a recombinant chimeric viruses. And we put the list of people who cooperate on that. They do patent during the time in China as in the United States with cooperation with the French people in Pasteur in Shanghai, in other countries, also in Karolinska, etc. So we have all the scientific evidence that SARS-CoV-2 was an hybrid chimeric virus that never existed in nature, that was progressively patented starting for SARS-like viruses that were RNA viruses that are very flexible. After in the United States they discovered the reverse transcriptase in the Vanderbilt University, so it was possible to create antiviral to stop the transcriptase, as was the remdesivir or Gilead. But what was the problem? That in a certain moment they decide to increase the potentiality of virulence of these viruses produced in laboratory with insert. That were the historical insert that Luc Montagnier discussed on HIV, and the Batwoman in China was a fellow on the guy who was responsible. He learned to create a pseudovirus HIV in France, but what was important was the insert of furin site. The insert furin site is an enzyme who controls 360 metabolic pathway in the human cells, not in other cells, in the human cells. So if you put this insert, you want to block this activity, you use a furin insert. And the furin insert, there are two versions. One that was created by Moderna and the patent, and the second version was created by Chinese using a natural insert of furin from some bacteria who colonize virus in the algae of the Sea of China. So we have fundamentally two versions of SARS-CoV-2 that we can detect it perfectly. When Rob Barry told that it was impossible to detect a virus who can manipulate with gain of function is false. Because each people who put insert into something, he put his signature. As Armani put his signature on his dress, do you know? The same thing. So now we are able to detect what is created in laboratory, what are the inserts, where they started, where they finish, in front of a natural product. So this is very important to define also the test that we must do, because tests must differentiate what is natural and what is synthetic.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tritto. So I just summarize that this method of genomic sequencing cannot produce valid and high-quality evidence for the proof of a real, existing, and dangerous new virus. Thank you very much. And now I hand over gladly the microphone to my dear colleague Beate Bahner, who will now take over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Philipp. Kruse. My name is Beate Bahner. I'm a German lawyer and author from Heidelberg, specialized in medical law. I have represented many hundreds of clients against corona measures, some of them prominently before the highest court. My last book, WHO Pandemic Treaty, analyzes both pandemic proposals and shows the real background and purposes of these two pandemic plans. So my aspect today is about the abuse of health protection for unlimited PCR testing and data collection, in the end, for the purpose of surveillance and control. Data is the new gold. In democracies, the state, however, needs a convincing pretext to request or even compel citizens to provide their highly private data. Thus, the WHO claims that health threats can only be identified at an early stage if states increase their capacities to diagnose and detect emerging threats to public health by constantly testing all their citizens. We all remember Corona, when people were no longer allowed anywhere without corresponding vaccination or without proof of testing. All of this is now to be legalized by the 2 pandemic legislation projects. Both pandemic proposals contain an almost unlimited expansion of data collection for the alleged purpose of health surveillance. This shall even include the constant monitoring of interactions between humans and animals. Each state shall therefore build up additional laboratory and diagnostic capacities in their public health systems in order to identify new and re-emerging pathogens. For this purpose, the WHO is even planning a so-called coordinated WHO laboratory network. During Corona, the herefore necessary samples were obtained due to the arbitrary PCR tests, which were demanded almost daily to participate in professional or social life. These tests were carried out 100 of millions of times in Germany alone. And we all know that these tests are not a valid diagnostic for proof of contagious pathogens. What is worrying here is the unbelievable extent of data collection, which is even to be supported by a so-called epidemiological intelligence surveillance. Sounds for me like Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. Well, Germany is one of the driving forces behind the 2 WHO pandemic proposals. With the WHO Hub for Pandemic and Epidemic Awareness, WHO Hub Berlin, founded in Berlin in September 2021. Germany is to become the data hub for pandemic control worldwide. The WHO pandemic plans also show an enormous collecting obsession with regard to genomic data. And it wants to oblige countries to undertake comprehensive genetic sequencing and thus global genomization of all citizens worldwide. This data mania has a concrete background, namely, you already talked about it, the ID 2020 project. The organization ID 2020, which stands for Identity 2020 Systems Incorporated, was founded in New York in 2017 by, listen well, Microsoft, Bill Gates, and by the Rockefeller Foundation, also by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance here in Geneva, and others. ID 2020 aims to give every person on Earth a digital identity by the year of 2030, whose data can be accessed in a cloud. This ID 2020 shall be usable for many different public and private purposes, but in any case for proof of vaccination and testing. The COVID-19 vaccination campaign has significantly advanced this digital identity project for all stakeholders, and it has provided IT companies and governments with a huge treasure trove of data about citizens that can be analyzed fully, automatically, in real time. What are the dangers of this testing and data obsession? Well, there are several considerable risks of data misuse. Through further intense PCR testing, new or re-emerging pathogens with pandemic potential can of course be discovered much more frequently. This will enable the WHO to declare fake pandemics, public health emergency of international concern, fake pandemics far more frequently in the future, even though these pathogens would otherwise go unnoticed and have no significant impact on the healthcare system. The further danger for citizens lies in the fact that with a unique digital identity, everything that a person does and has ever done can be called up. This means the end of all privacy. Another real abuse scenario is the so-called privatization of data, especially the transfer of powers to collect and analyze publicly collected data to private companies, which is already happening in a very wide extent. The greatest danger, however, is the social control and the possibility of excluding disagreeable citizens and companies from society and from economy. This can easily be realized by restricting their digital identity in terms of time, content, or money, or even by completely locking down this person digitally. China is leading the way with its social credit system. Anyone who has collected a bad score is not allowed to travel, to shop, or even to withdraw money. If the state blocks the ID card, nothing works. As a summary, the planned unlimited expansion of testing and data collection does not serve our health. And it obviously does not serve the protection of health. Its only purpose is the total control of all citizens worldwide by vaccine passports and travel restrictions if people refuse to get jabbed or tested, combined with the misuse of personal data for huge financial profits by global corporations. So we urgently have to stop these very sinister plans of the WHO to control, profit, and govern by fake pandemics. The plans are tyrannical and dehumiliating. They're based on fraud and abuse and violation of law. Thank you for your attention.
And now I give the floor to the French colleague. I give now the floor to the French colleague Laeticia Rigault, which will present a summary of the most important elements in French. Thank you.
Oui, bonjour à tous. Je ne sais pas si ça marche. Je suis donc Laeticia Rigault, avocate. J'ai été avocat à Luxembourg pendant très très nombreuses années, plus de 20 ans, et avocate française depuis le même temps. Et donc je suis membre du collectif des 300 avocats français qui effectivement se sont mobilisés au moment de la pandémie pour essayer de défendre les droits et libertés en France. Je vais être la voix française de cette conférence à destination du monde francophone pour vous faire effectivement une synthèse des éléments qui nous occupent et de ce qui vient d'être expliqué. Donc, comme l'a rappelé Philipp Kruse en début d'intervention, les discussions se poursuivent à l'AMS. On n'a pas à ce jour les conclusions puisque les négociations ont continué cette nuit. Mais il semblerait, ça avait déjà été annoncé pour le traité pandémique, qu'il va être reporté et que le règlement sanitaire international, les amendements soient également reportés dans le courant de cette année, sans qu'on ait de précision pour l'instant. Et donc effectivement, toutes nos analyses reposent sur des textes qui pour l'instant sont provisoires. Pourquoi nous protestons et pourquoi nous sommes rassemblés aujourd'hui et pourquoi nous demandons le rejet de ces textes ? Il y a différentes raisons. Comme l'a rappelé Philippe, l'article 55.2 du RSI prévoit que tous les amendements et un texte final doivent être présentés aux États 4 mois au moins avant l'adoption de ces textes. C'est l'article 55.2 qui le prévoit. Or, les discussions se poursuivent ces derniers jours. Excusez-moi. Les dernières versions nous ont été présentées au mois d'avril et de mai. Et donc, ce délai de 4 mois n'est absolument pas respecté. On ne peut pas nous expliquer que ça fait 2 ans qu'on travaille et que donc on est parfaitement au courant du contenu des textes pour nous expliquer qu'on ne respecte pas ce délai de 4 mois. Ça n'est pas acceptable. Ce qui nous interpelle aussi, ce sont les atteintes extrêmement importantes à la souveraineté des États et aux libertés individuelles que nous jugeons inacceptables. La Suisse, la Grande-Bretagne et le Japon se sont déjà exprimés contre ces projets en indiquant qu'effectivement, ils n'accepteraient pas des atteintes aussi importantes à leur souveraineté. Quelles sont ces atteintes ? On en a beaucoup parlé, tous les intervenants en ont ici parlé. La mise en place d'une surveillance permanente et généralisée sur les États, les citoyens, sur l'eau, sur les maladies, sur le séquencement génomique, mais aussi sur les animaux, sur le climat et sur la paix, parce qu'on assiste à un changement total de cadre, c'est-à-dire qu'avec ces projets, jusqu'à maintenant, l'OMS était chargée de venir en support des États, aider les États dans la gestion des pandémies. Avec les textes qui nous sont proposés, c'est vraiment une mainmise de l'OMS, c'est une tentative de prise de pouvoir de l'OMS sur la santé mondiale. On n'est plus du tout dans un support et dans une aide, on est vraiment dans une prise en main de la santé mondiale. Ce changement de cadre ne nous convient pas tant qu'il n'est pas encadré. On vous a parlé de la collecte de données, on vous a parlé de la digitalisation des process, on vous a parlé passe sanitaire et on vous a expliqué que tout ça était pour nous le terreau d'un crédit à la chinoise que nous refusons. La détermination des urgences de santé publique de portée internationale qui est laissée entre les mains du directeur général de l'OMS puisqu'il peut prendre des avis mais qu'il est seul finalement à prendre les décisions. La définition de cette urgence sanitaire de santé publique de portée internationale est beaucoup trop floue aujourd'hui pour donner quelques garanties que ce soit. Il n'y a aucun élément chiffré en termes de létalité, en termes de nombre de cas, en termes de nombre de pays atteints. Donc effectivement, on ne peut pas se satisfaire de définitions qui sont aussi floues et qui en fait sont la porte ouverte à n'importe quelle prise de décision. Surtout quand on combine ça avec la concentration des pouvoirs entre les mains du directeur général de l'OMS qui, comme je vous l'ai dit, doit prendre des avis, mais prendra seul les décisions. Monsieur Alfred Schwartz vous a très clairement rappelé les atteintes à la souveraineté qui sont encourues. La souveraineté, c'est le fait de pouvoir évaluer une situation. Là, le DG de l'OMS le fera pour les États, et c'est le pouvoir de prendre des mesures pour répondre à cette situation. Le DG de l'OMS le fera aussi à la place des États. Donc les atteintes à la souveraineté sont juste inacceptables. On passe d'un organisme d'aide à une autorité coordinatrice de la santé mondiale. Donc ça, c'est très important à comprendre. Il n'y a pas de limite sur les recommandations que le directeur général de l'OMS va pouvoir prendre. Confinement, vaccins, même s'ils n'ont pas été testés, ça nous a été expliqué, il n'y a absolument aucune limite qui sont portées aux atteintes à la liberté de prescrire, à la liberté de circuler, à la liberté ou non de se faire vacciner. Donc ces éléments ne sont pas acceptables. Il n'y a évidemment aucun système de contrôle qui est mis en place pour contrôler l'OMS et le directeur général de l'OMS dans ces nouveaux projets. Je vous rappelle que l'Union européenne, ça a été également rappelé, a pris cette semaine des textes pour expliquer qu'elle allait aussi aller dans ce même sens de prise en main de la santé européenne. Donc c'est vraiment un mouvement global et qui nous inquiète extrêmement. Alors, quels sont les préalables obligatoires pour qu'effectivement on puisse commencer à parler de ces projets que pour l'instant nous rejetons en bloc? C'est effectivement une analyse et une évaluation de la gestion qui a été faite par l'OMS de la pandémie Covid-19. Comme on vous l'a rappelé, on nous a imposé très largement, puisque les atteintes étaient tellement importantes qu'on peut considérer qu'il y avait une obligation de vaccination sur des vaccins qui n'avaient pas été testés et qui ne répondaient pas à nos normes européennes en termes de respect notamment du consentement des personnes. Donc, aujourd'hui, il est acquis que ces vaccins n'empêchaient pas la transmission et c'est pourtant comme ça qu'on nous l'a vendu au début de la pandémie, sans sourciller. Donc, effectivement, cette analyse de la gestion de la pandémie par l'OMS, elle est pour nous un préalable indispensable à toute avancée. Le respect de la souveraineté des États sera une ligne rouge qui ne pourra pas être franchie. Et il nous faut des garanties sur l'indépendance financière et politique de l'OMS, puisqu'on sait qu'en termes de financement, on a déjà des sujets, il n'y a pas de système de contrôle de la corruption au sein de l'OMS, et tout ça est tout simplement inacceptable pour lui confier des sujets aussi importants que la gestion de la santé mondiale. Voilà, c'est donc à juste titre qu'à ce jour nous nous interrogeons sur la façon dont l'OMS a géré la future pandémie et sur la façon dont elle entend prendre la main sur la santé mondiale, et d'où notre présence ici face à vous. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Laeticia Rigault de la France. Thank you very much, my dear colleague, Laeticia Rigault, for summarizing the most important points in French. Now, we start to establish, and we try to establish the contact.
No.
Oh, we have no more to do. Yes, please. And now, as next, I would like to give the floor to my dear colleague from the Netherlands, Meike Terhorst. Please. Meike. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philipp, Kruse, for inviting me to speak here. My name is Meike Terhorst. I'm attorney at law in Alkmaar, the Netherlands. I work with Shabnam, Palesa, Mohamed from World Council for Health, who is the next speaker. She's living in South Africa. Together, we started the Lawyers Against WHO, LAW. And as lawyers and activists from around the world, we want to help each other to stop the transfer of powers from the local or national level to WHO. And I have some very good news for you, because everybody from around the world is very afraid for this transfer of powers, that WHO can take over all our rights, can overrule our rights. And we found a way to stop this process, because what we simply can do is declare that it's not valid, this transfer of powers. So it has been hiding in plain sight, so to speak. It's not a coincidence that this pushback comes from the Netherlands, because we suffered one of the most terrible lockdowns and lock-ups and violence in the Netherlands, and terrible things that happened during demonstrations. But after that came the good news, because in the Netherlands, it was, I believe, the only parliament in the world that recently the parliament stood up against the government to stop this transfer of powers at WHO. Powerwoman Mona Keizer, she started a motion to request the government to ask the World Health Assembly to postpone the vote on the international health regulations, because the texts were not delivered 4 months in advance. And this was done on purpose, because half a year before, the lawyer of WHO had announced that they would not keep the 4 months deadline. So the parliament said, either we have to ask to postpone, or we have to say no. And the Minister of Health, she simply wanted to ignore this. And then the parliament became very angry. So we had a debate with another motion, and then the minister said, well, then we will not say yes, and we'll also not say no, which is a typical solution in the Netherlands. But this was not the end of the matter, because I sent a request to the parliament to sign a declaration of invalidity. And this letter was signed, indeed, by 4 brave senators. And I want to read the names: Erik Kemperman, Robert van Gasteren, Johan Dessing, and Bart Kroon. And I thank you very much. Erik told me that he receives every week 200 emails from citizens from the Netherlands that are afraid of this transfer of powers to WHO and what will happen in the future. And so he was very, very glad to do something for them. What about this declaration of invalidity? Well, it is a very simple matter. In the Dutch constitution and Dutch legal system, the parliament is the highest power in our kingdom. So the minister is not authorized to just transfer the powers that belong to the parliament to Dr. Terhorst himself. Also, the World Health Assembly is bound by the constitution of the WHO. And in the constitution, it's said in the recitals that the governments have the responsibility for the health of their people. And that it's also pointed out in Article 2 that the WHO powers are of an advisory nature. So basically, they take something, they try to take something that they don't have, which is illegal. So, and what is the aim of the current amendments of the AHR? Well, it's a digital vaccination passport. And of course, it's very dangerous because it's a technical means to overrule all our personal rights. And even Reggie has explained it very well. Like, it's very dangerous because it can lead to surveillance society and, yeah, like the end of all our freedoms. And what's important is to ask yourself, for whom is WHO working? And I think it's very clear that WHO is executing the agenda of the WEF. And that is a collaboration between the G20, 20 most powerful nations in the world, and the 500 richest companies in the world. So basically, there's this combination of power, this great concentration of power. And yesterday, we tried to hand over the letters of the senators to Dr. Terhorst himself. And so with former Member of Parliament Ruben van Haga, we wanted to hand it over. And then we heard that Dr. Terhorst was in the hotel. So we tried to find him, looked everywhere, but he was not there. He had already left. So then we took a cab to the World Health Organization. And there we heard he was not there. He was in the palace of the United Nations. So then we went there. And at the palace, they said, no, you have to go back to the WHO. And before the building, we met some people from the delegation from another country, and they said that they had bought a one-way ticket to Geneva, and they were not allowed to go back before they had said yes to all the amendments.
Wow.
Yes. And they were saying it quite laughingly, like it was quite normal. And and then we went in, and then they said they were not allowed to officially receive these letters. But we could send an email. So I've sent an email to Dr. Terhorst and asked him whether he would like to personally receive those letters from the Parliament of the Netherlands on the stage. And so I gave him my telephone number so he can, if he wants to, come to the center stage in Geneva. So I'm quite curious to see whether he will do it or not. Anyway, I think what we see is, with the WHO, we see a false facade of legality. And brick by brick, we have to take down this facade. And we also see a false facade of democracy. It is not a nice, gentle meeting where everybody is equal. Not at all. So I would like to end this to say what is started as an attempt for a corporate takeover could well become a corporate pushback. Because as all citizens in the world, we have the power to stop this, and we will do this. And I'm getting more and more convinced of this. And special thanks in this respect to Shabnam, my dear colleague from South Africa, who's been a tremendous force, and Philipp, of course, and all your others. So thank you.
Thank you, Meike Terhorst from the Netherlands.
Here from New Zealand to join us in this press conference. Please, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for coming today. It's so exciting after all of our years of being isolated in New Zealand to actually be back with the world. And I'm so sorry that we sent you our Dr. Ashley Bloomfield to be one of the coordinators of these horrible international health regulations. I'm a specialist in complex emerging legal issues. I've got tertiary qualifications in law and in science and in public health. And I've acted in many of the New Zealand COVID cases, including the Baby W case that many of you may have heard about. I'm also the co-author of this book about the Freedom Village, which is a book about our 23-day convoy and occupation of New Zealand Parliament. I'm a big advocate for people power, because we can use the law as much as we like, but actually when it's the people standing up and saying, no, we've had enough, that really we can make change. And that's what we did in New Zealand. We'd had enough, and it made a difference. So I'm talking about informed consent, because really with health, we've been told so much about this pandemic, this fear and this hype, and that drugs are the only solution. But we know it's not true. We know that health is from our environment. It is the way we act. It is so many more things than just expecting an injection in the arm. And that's why it's so important that we continue to remind ourselves about what it is to be a human being, what it is that we have individual needs. There is never one cure fixes all. It is always looking at our own desires, our values, our circumstances, and reclaiming our own body sovereignty that is so important. And that is why it's so difficult seeing what the World Health Organization is trying to do. They're doing the opposite of even their own definition of health. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmary. But they are trying to do the opposite of their own interpretation. They're trying to make it into a medicalization pharmaceutical solution, one size fits all. This paternalistic approach is the opposite of what is required for informed consent, for healthy communities, healthy people. That the overreach of what they're doing, cutting right across informed consent. This doing with fear and ideology rather than sound law and sound science. They're undermining the absolute fundamentals, do no harm. Informed consent and the need for proportionality, absolutely fundamental principles of both law and medicine. And we have good international law already. We have the UN Charter, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, that are intended to protect us against this abuse of power from our own governments, and now we need it even more to protect us from the other international organizations. We have the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the customary international law, the Nuremberg Principles, to protect us against experimentation on us. And the World Health Organization, whatever treaties, whatever regulations that may pass, they cannot override these long established rights. So over the last few years, we've witnessed so much harm from the COVID response. We've witnessed so much more harm from the COVID response than we ever witnessed from COVID. We've killed our people with experimental medication. In New Zealand, Rory Nan, a young man at no risk from COVID, died because he was coerced to get medical treatment, this experimental mRNA injection, so he could go to his own wedding. He never made his wedding because he died a few days after the experimentation, after the injection, because our government imposed this discrimination on our people. And Rory is far from the only one. We all have examples. When we talk to each other, we all have examples of so much harm that this so-called safe and effective treatment has caused to our family, our friends, our communities. So the law is simple. The law is very simple. An injection without informed consent is assault. And an injection without informed consent that causes death is homicide. There can be no treaty that overtakes these fundamental principles of law. And as my colleagues have said, we need to stand up and take back our power. We can't get sucked down this path of big government knows best, globalists know best. We have to stand strong in our power. So that's all I need to say, and I thank everybody for being here.
Thank you very much, my dear colleague Sue Gray from New Zealand. Thank you.
Now, we try to establish contact to South Africa, and we communicated in between. So here we have Shabnam, Palesa, Mohamed, and just, Shabnam, can you hear me? Are you there? Continue what you're doing right now, Shabnam, it's all good. We bridge over. So in case, we said with Shabnam, in case it would not work, she is about to record her message, and that message would then be added to the live stream that is about to be taken by Hoch 2 here. And by the way, I would like to thank Hoch 2 for their services to provide the live stream. Thank you so much, Regina and Patrick. So, while we let Shabnam Palesa Mohamed continue recording her message, I would like now, as we have all spoken, we have nobody forgotten, I would like to open the Q&A session now. So it's about to you, the journalists here, whom we are very thankful for coming and so thankful for reporting, to ask you questions. So now, please take the micro, and who is the first to ask a question?
There was a lot of confusion this week trying to follow the WHO proceedings. From my understanding, a drafting group was developed to try to put together at the last minute the final package of IHR amendments. I could not find anywhere on the World Health Assembly website any decision for the establishment of this drafting group. It's under something, from my understanding, called Committee A. I was told that Committee A was responsible for passing the 2022 IHR amendments, and that violations of the WHO's policies were that took place then as well. So I'd like to know, did they even have a legal authority to put together this drafting group or drafting committee and to try to put together right at the World Health Assembly itself these amendments, or was this a totally illegal process?
I don't know the details about it, but I can tell you the principles, and that is that the World Health Assembly is the correct authority for establishing committees, whether it is for the establishing of a new agreement or for the continuation of negotiations of one of these two new legal instruments. And this would be something we would expect that they would do it, because the mandate for providing these two legal instruments for a vote to the World Health Assembly has been terminated by today. And so for the continuation of this process, they will need to establish new working groups. And we can expect that this will happen. Now we have Shabnam, Palesa, Mohamed. We just briefly do a test whether it now works. Shabnam, can you hear me? No. Oh. We have this very nice picture. Unfortunately, it is frozen. Shabnam, I hope you hear me. We stay in contact via my assistant. Oh, here you are. Shabnam, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Philipp. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you a little bit. I try to foster your signal. Yes, the microphone. Okay, Shabnam, we try again.
Yes. Are you going to play the recording, or would you like me to speak?
Well, as we hear you right now, I would prefer to hear you speak live and briefly introduce yourself. And is it possible for you to hear it? Sorry? Yep. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Can you make a sound test for the audience here?
Yes. Testing. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon from South Africa.
Is it possible for you to hear that? Yes. Excellent. We can hear you. Fantastic. So we have here Shabnam, Palesa. Yes, we have here Shabnam, Palesa, Mohamed, and we try to make this out as possible. But here you go from South Africa live. Thank you so much for coming and for being with us, Shabnam.
Thank you for the invitation, Philipp, Renate, and of course my dear friends and allies, lawyers from around the world. My name is Shabnam Palesa Mohamed. I am a lawyer, journalist, and activist from South Africa, and I serve on 4 different organizations, including Transformative Health Justice, the Children's Health Defense Africa, the African Sovereignties Coalition, and the World Council for Health at an international level. So, of course, colleagues, the purpose of law is the pursuit of justice. We know that the UN and the WHO violated or facilitated the violation of multiple human rights during the COVID-19 chapter, including the right to free speech, the right to movement, the right to work, the right to health, most essentially. And currently, this expansion of power, which is being facilitated by both, is what we as lawyers and civil society are resisting around the world. Now, the criteria to actually declare public health emergency of international concern is very clear. And you can find that in a legal brief on worldcouncilforhealth.org. There's 4 criteria, really. The threat must be actual or imminent, involve the whole nation, place the continuation of the organized life of society at risk of extinction, and 4, be so extraordinary that ordinary measures for protecting public health and order are clearly inadequate. Now, if you cast your mind back to COVID-19, it's very clear that none of those criteria were actually met for the purposes of declaring a public health emergency of international concern, and neither the WHO nor the United Nations actually spoke out. So, of course, there's many outcomes of the WHO or WHA 77 that actually need to be reviewed by us as lawyers and civil society. But what many member states are complaining about is being rushed. We are also told there are allegations around member states being threatened that they have to come out of this process with the IHR amendments being signed. Certainly very dangerous times. And when we look at the WHO through a critical lens, the problems are not only existing now through these 2 agreements. There's a long history of controversies, H1N1, opioid scandal, tobacco scandal, nuclear scandal. And of course, there are multiple failures in recommendations during COVID-19. When you look at their financials, it's very evident that there are irregular audits, there's wasteful expenditure, and all of this is tied into conflicts of interest where the WHO is funded by essentially the pharmaceutical industry. And so I've drafted a bill on preventing the conflicts of interest in decision making, which I hope to share with everyone at some point. But the fraud and corruption also extends to travel expenses, exorbitant salaries, and there's no accountability. We do not elect them. We do not elect our member state representatives. So if you look at the agenda for the WHA 77 mini documents to review, it includes reform of the WHO. You might want to watch an event World Council for Health recently hosted called "Can the WHO be reformed?" And the response is a resounding no, not least of which is linked to serious harms caused by the COVID-19 and other shots. And these documents trying to give indemnity to the pharmaceutical industry, or globalizing the indemnity given to the pharmaceutical industry. The harms, of course, we're seeing around our world, including in South Africa, documented through SA VEDS. Now, other allegations against the WHO are against its leadership, including its Director General Terhorst, who has in Ethiopia been accused of committing acts of genocide. And I've interviewed someone who has filed a case at the International Criminal Court against him. And of course, the WHO has also been accused of facilitating infertility in Kenya, where they facilitated tetanus shots to Kenyan girls and women only, which were laced with HCG and rendered them infertile. These are symptoms, violent symptoms of neo-colonialism and corporate imperialism. And here are two examples. The contracts that were really supported by the WHO with Pfizer, for example, with Latin American and African countries, tried to include clauses that would give Pfizer as security for that vaccine debt a country's military, reserve banks, and embassies. These are national sovereign assets. If a country can't pay its debt for whatever reason, it would enable Pfizer to steal those sovereign assets, and that's why I call it corporate colonization, very dangerous. In addition, Article 12 of the amendments to the IHR would give the Director General of the WHO the unilateral authority to declare a public health emergency of international concern, whether or not your country agrees. Again, a very dangerous geopolitical weapon if your country is doing something that the WHO's funders or the globalist cartel don't like. Then, of course, there's clauses around pathogen access and sharing, which for me, coming from South Africa with our history of apartheid and biological weapons, is very dangerous. You might also want to read about the exploitation, sexual exploitation by WHO workers of the girls and women of the DRC and children and men in an article I've written on Children's Health Defense Africa. Now, countries are thankfully speaking up, as I mentioned earlier, Argentina, Belarus, Paraguay, Iran, and Uganda. We're very grateful, but much more must be done to protect our right to free speech and to jealously defend the right to public participation, which is being violated throughout this entire process. We must say, nothing for us without us. What have we done? As I start to round up, I've served a notice on the WHO on Monday. It includes strong paragraphs around public participation, referring to the WHO's own constitution, as well as the Alma Ata principles, and importantly includes a declaration of invalidity, which my friend Meike Terhorst has spoken about, the statement of dispute around Article 55, very important, and a notice of objection to the UN's power grab and the areas that it wants control over, including a political declaration made by the UN in September last year, unlawfully, despite 11 countries speaking out. So please serve this document on the WHO and the UN and sign the petition in support. I've also drafted last night a proposal for resolution that a member state representative can use. Hopefully they can find it. We've asked for it to be shared widely, calling for an actual vote on these two agreements as opposed to a consensus procedure, which means that the motion would just be announced, there would be no raising of hands, and the World Health Assembly President would announce the resolution passed. Very dangerous, undemocratic, and reckless. Of course, we must insist the process is halted, or there must be an actual vote so we can see where member state delegates unelected by us actually stand. In conclusion, again, I would encourage everyone to watch the film WHO's Power Grab. I don't know how much more time I have, but I've been racing through given the time limit. The film is made in South Africa, and it features over 100 health freedom advocates and ethical politicians speaking out against the WHO-led power grabs. Not the WHO alone. Member states themselves, as well as corporate funders, are themselves equally complicit. I would like to suggest that we host World Freedom Month every May as long as the WHO exists, and even beyond that, as we're doing in the World Council for Health. And I would urge us to continue our resistance as we build a better way for health, freedom, and sovereignty, because the power of the people is greater than people in power. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shabnam Palesa Mohamed from South Africa, the great lawyer and journalist. This was your applause. We could hear you very well as a representative from South Africa, as a representative from the African continent, and obviously also as a representative from the board of World Council for Health. Thank you so much for coming. Now, here we are. We have some more 15 minutes now for our Q&A, a brief Q&A session. And I would like now, please to turn over the microphone to the first question, please.
Yeah, Shabnam just brought up a great point. I'm with the highwire.com in America. If you're stating that we do not elect the WHO and we do not elect the member state representatives, could someone explain exactly how the WHO is formed, who hires or elects Tedros, and who elects these member state representatives?
Okay, who wants?
The organization, basically the WHO, is a special agency of the United Nations. It's worth noting, by the way, that the United Nations entered an agreement with the WEF, with the World Economic Forum, for strategic partnership that happened on the 19th of, I believe it was June in 2019. The World Health Organization basically appoints its own people based on whatever internal process that they have. They are not elected individuals by any stretch of the imagination. Another thing that needs to be clarified, they have absolutely no power to do anything in international law unless states sign over and enter agreements and treaties. By definition, international law is more like a contractual law. It's basically enter a contract and an agreement between states to behave in a certain manner. And if we don't give them the power, they would be powerless. And that needs to be addressed. The whole idea of law, as we understand it internally in countries, is not the way international law works. Not only that, the only way for them to reach us internally in the country is based on the notion or the concept of pacta sunt servanda, which is agreements should be adhered to. The notion is addressed in the Vienna Convention of 1959, and it's addressed in two articles there. I believe it's Article 20 that stipulates that agreements should be adhered to, and Article 46 says that a state cannot invoke internal law in defiance of the agreement. Now, the result is that every agreement that is signed internationally is being internalized into the local law. Some countries do it automatically. I know for a fact that that's what happens in France. I'm not sure about I think many European countries, do that. But by definition, when you're asking where do they get their power from, they're being given the power because states signed the power over.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alfred. Schwartz, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for the work that you all have done and inspiration. I'm Kim Yater from the Take Your Power Back show in the United States. We in the United States are a sovereign country. Each state is a sovereign state. Each individual is a sovereign being, our sovereignty coming from our Creator. Reggie, this question is for you. Reggie, what can we, the people, do right now to hold our governments accountable to not playing into this agreement, not signing on anything, but completely holding them accountable to we, the people, our voices being heard?
Thank you for your question. And there are a number of things that people can do. One is go on to the Sovereignty Coalition website, go on to the Anti-Globalist International website, sign our manifesto. There are action items on those websites. Beyond that, you're a woman of faith. We can pray. Prayer is essential. And beyond that, you can call your representatives, okay, on the state level, the national level, on the local level. And also when, in debates, people can attend the debates and raise questions over and over and over again. If every debate people are saying, what's your position on the internet, on the World Health Organization? Should we withdraw? Should we defund? What's your position on the amendments to the International Health Regulations, the pandemic treaty? And just keep hammering them with questions over and over and over again to make it a major campaign issue and to make our voices heard in November, that this is a very, very important issue to us. Thank you.
Also, Alfred Schwartz.
If I may add a number of things, since I happen to be also affiliated with the United States, one of the things that you can do is to apply to your governors and to internally in each state force the local legislation. I know that in different states their numbers may be different, but once you acquire a certain amount, a certain number of signatures, you can force a debate in the legislation of the individual state. I think I don't remember the numbers. I don't want to say something I'm not sure, but I'm definitely certain that that procedure exists. The other thing is that in the United States actually speaks to some degree from both sides of its mouth, if you happen to know the expression. The United States rejected some article in the pandemic treaty. Was it the pandemic treaty or the IHR? Yeah, I think it was the pandemic treaty that had to do with genomics and sharing of information, and they said, well, we are a federal nation, and the federal law does, since every state has its own legislation to some degree and has some independence, the result of that is that we cannot enforce federal law in all aspects. Iran, by the way, responded and said, well, what you're actually doing, you're nullifying the entire agreement when you're saying that you do not have the power to enforce the federal law, and you would need to employ the idea of federal supremacy. But it's a matter of their choosing, they're picking and choosing what to do. So it all boils down to get the people on the street and in their homes, get them to be familiar and express their opinion. It ultimately and finally will come down to what happens in November, hoping that we don't see the same fiasco that we saw 4 years ago.
Thank you, Alfred Schwartz. Thank you.
I want to do some comments on your question, but also on the first question, because the problem on WHO is similar for all the other agencies of the United Nations. I was many times in UNESCO, we have always the problem where coming the money. You know that regularly there is a regular budget of whatsoever agency of the United Nations and the extra budget. The extra budget is only for special program, but also for donors. It cannot be superior to the budget of the agency. So the agency is sponsored by the country with each specific budget. In Italy, it's 100 million each year, okay? So on this budget, you approve the general agenda of your agency. And after, you ask it to approve some project with extra budget money, for example, Foundation, Bill Gates, he creates some things in UNESCO too, but must be approved by Assembly. But because it's an extra budget money, it must fit completely all the rules of the United Nations Charter. You understand? So there is a second control on the extra budget program from the United Nations Central. What happened from the period when Madame Chang was nominated in WHO? They decided to open to Big Pharma to be partner, but this was never validated by the United Nations General Assembly. So all this part of the things is completely irregular, but some countries support this type of partnership because it was very useful for them, for the national budget, so there are the exception of the national country on that. But in any way, what they have done, the last leadership is totally irregular in terms of the law of the United Nations, related to the agency of the United Nations. The maneuver is to transform WHO in an independent organization, supranational, external, that taking in charge the security of health of population. That is another issue that we call the biomilitarization of WHO. That's all.
Just on a final note, to my recollection, because I think that the state of Colorado, which happens to where I graduated in mechanical engineering, is I think they have a 40,000 signatures requirement in order to force the legislation to actually deal with some issue, if the number is correct. I think that's what I seem to remember, but check in every country.
So just to respond to your question with one sentence, as we all are concerned, our future lives are concerned, our health is concerned, our genomes are concerned, it is about whole humanity to stand up. And we just want to help this process to foster, and we will hand over this information to you, to the media. And we have many lawyers here, and I want to show that there are so many lawyers, even more, who can provide, helping you, providing the message. And we are so grateful that you are here and that you are about to inform the people, because we cannot make it just a few experts or just a few lawyers. We need a very strong movement that really kicks the asses of our political representatives in a very clear and strong way. Because right now, the politicians, the representatives of our countries here around the corner, they are about to commit treason. They commit for us without our consent. So let's wake up and give them a very clear signal from the basis over our representatives that we still trust in the parliaments. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
What can we do? We have to declare and declare and declare again and again that the WHO is abusing law and violating law. They are abusing our legal system. They are abusing also contracts, yeah? And in the same time, they are, by doing this, violating law. We have to explain and declare.
Thank you. We have the Bahner from Germany. I'm a lawyer
from Italy, as you know, and Italy was the country with the worst vaccination mandate and measures in all over Europe. And now we have a great advantage. The population began to understand. I know that, especially in Italy, on all levels, politicians on municipality level, on regional level, and on national level, are getting letters from the citizen who are asking, making questions. And our effort will be to give the citizen the drafts for that letters, and in order that the politicians have to respond. And so we are able to empower us citizens all together to stop this dystopian development.
Thank you, Renate Holzeisen. So one last question.
I have a question just to differentiate between the EU and individual countries. When you're fighting this legally, are there different representatives per your country or as the EU?
Yeah, your question is a good question because it is a very strange situation because as I explained, on a European Union level, they decided already to go with the modification of the IHR and with the pandemic treaty. So we have our single individual European Union member states which are here as with their delegations in order to decide if they want to have which kind of modification of the IHR and the pandemic treaty, but within the Council of the European Union and the members of the European Union Parliament already decided that we in the European Union have already the One Health principle and the health in all policy principle, and we already decided with regulations which have which are in power as law in each European Union member state that the leadership of the WHO is recognized. So they did something very crazy, going beyond the power of the European Union Parliament and of the Council of the European Union. This is ultra vires, and we have to get them responsible for that. And it is for that that we, as citizens of the European Union, have to struggle more than in the rest of the world to get out of this very illegal situation.
Thank you, Renate Holzeisen. Reggie Littlejohn.
I just want to emphasize the urgency of the situation that we're in right now, which is that we may feel like we've had a reprieve, almost like a stay of execution, because both of these agreements have gone off the table for now. They're not going to be voted on. But the European Union and the World Economic Forum last year already started rolling out these digital IDs and these vaccine passports. They don't need to have these agreements in place in order to effectuate what I would call a digital gulag, because I showed you the chart from the World Economic Forum of all the things that they're going to be surveilling us on. They're going to be able to control us on it. And once this is operationalized, which could happen anytime soon, they don't have to wait for the passage of these treaties. There will be no more dissent, because if you try to dissent, you're going to be surveilled, you're going to be censored, you can be cut off from your credit cards and your bank accounts, and just basically paralyzed from society. And the time to stand up is now, because once we lose our freedom, it will be basically impossible to get it back.
Thank you, Reggie. So now we have to come to an end. There will be time afterwards for interviews until 1:15 o'clock. Please feel free to do so. And so hereby, in the name of all of my colleagues here from 9 different countries, 10 different lawyers, which is a unique undertaking so far, That has never taken place so far, so we are very proud that we were able to do so, and we want to thank you for spreading the word, and we will certainly gladly cooperate together with you to help the message bring out. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, thank you. And just to add, one very concrete step to say no to the WHO will take place this afternoon at 1:30 on Place des Nations. Please join us for the biggest rally for a very long time against WHO and to declare our independence from the WHO. We will declare our independence. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. There, thank you. We declare our independence. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Reggie.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Renate. Sehr gut. Yes.
Oval Media hat dann noch gebeten, um ein kurzes Statement. Sie haben aufgeschrieben, was sie wollen. Hast du noch Zeit oder nicht?
Simon, drin oder draußen?
Merci.